Good morning, Year 6. We're going to continue with our reading lesson, but today we are going to start with our literal questions, which means we are going to be taking information from the text and answering our question using the evidence from the text. So now I'm going to share my screen and we're going to start with our vocabulary. So my turn. The first word is sodden. This is an adjective and it means something that's saturated with liquid. For example, you can have a material that's sodden, it's saturated with liquid, especially water when you can see it's soaked through. In a sentence I've written, after she came back from jumping in puddles, her clothes were sodden, suggesting that her clothes were wet. Our next word is another adjective and it's accustomed. And this means to become used to. So you could say, she became accustomed to the rules after living in London for so long. Accustomed. We next have a verb which is scrambled, and this means to make one's way up quickly or awkwardly up a steep gradient, and it's usually over rough ground using your hands or your feet. So in a sentence I've written, during her daily walks, she scrambled up the steep hillside and over the rocks to watch the beautiful view. Scrambled. We next have another adjective, and that's unbearable. And this means to not be able to endure or tolerate. So you could say the heat in Dubai in July is unbearable, which means it's too hot, they can't tolerate it. Unbearable. Word, which is another verb, is clustered, and this means to be grouped together or bunched together almost. So as you can see in this picture here, they've been grouped together following these arrows. In a sentence I've written, the students clustered round the guest speaker to hear his story. So that means they grouped round to listen to his story. We then have another verb, and that's entwined. And this means to wind or twist together, almost interweaving something. So you can see here, you could describe the tree branches here as being entwined, as they're twisted together. In a sentence, I've written, the roses entwine the little cottage, which means they've twisted round the little cottage. And sometimes you can see that. Maybe if you spot a house on your daily walk with flowers or plants entwined, I'd love to see a picture on Seesaw. We then have another verb, and that is convulse. And this means to shake violently or uncontrollably. For example, you could say a racking cough convulsed her whole body, which means the cough was so bad it shook her whole body. We then have barely, and this means hardly or scarcely. So you could say, looking at this image here, there was barely any Sunday roast left. Barely. Lastly, we have our adjective, which is bitter. And this means to show a feeling of anger or resentment or hurt towards someone because of a bad experience. So you could say, I was bitter towards my friends because they kept playing pranks on me. Bitter. Now going to read our words right from the beginning. I'd like you to pause the video and repeat the words back after me. Sodden. Accustomed. Scrambled. Unbearable. Clustered, entwined, convulse, barely, bitter. We're now going to move on and read the text together. Please make sure you pause the video and get hold of your text. That could be on the screen or in front of you. It was a girl's voice. Remember here from our previous chapter that we read last week, we know that Fred was quite terrified and scared because he just heard a sudden voice, but now we know that the voice belongs to a girl. Fred looked out from behind the tree. The light of the moon filtered deep green to the forest floor, casting long-fingered shadows against the trees, and he could only see two bushes, both of them rustling. This suggests to me, rustling, the verb, is that because of the wind or maybe because someone's hiding in the bush? Who is it? The voice came from the second bush. Fred squinted through the dark. Squinted was one of our key vocabulary words from last week. Pause the video and have a go. Do you remember what squinted means? Well done if you said squinted means looking at something with your eyes partly closed. Feeling the remaining hair rise up on his arms. Please don't hurt us, said the bush. The accent wasn't British. It was something softer and the voice was definitely a child's, not an adult. Was it you throwing poo? Fred looked down at the ground. He snatched up a piece of years-old fossilized animal dung, which means old animal poo. Oh, he said, yes, he was becoming accustomed, another one of our key vocabulary words for this week, which means becoming used to. He was becoming used to the dark, and he could see a shine of eyes peering out from the grey-green gloom of the undergrowth. Are you from the plain? Are you hurt? Yes, we are hurt. We fell out of the sky, said one bush, as the other said, no, not badly. You can come out, said Fred. It's only me here. The second bush parted. Fred's heart gave a great leap. Both the girl and her brother were covered in scratches and burns and ash, which had mixed with sweat and rain and made a kind of paste on their faces, but they were alive. He was not alone. You survived, he said. Obviously we did, said the first bush, or we'd be less talkative, wouldn't we? The blonde girl stepped out into the lashing rain, suggesting here that it's pouring with rain. She stared from Fred to the other two, unsmiling. I'm Con, she said. It's short for Constantia, but if you call me that, I'll kill you. Fred glanced at the other girl, which means he looked at the other girl. She smiled nervously and shrugged. Right, he said, if you say so. I'm Fred. I'm Lila, said the second girl. She held her brother on her hip. And this is Max. Hi. Fred tried to smile, but it made the cuts on his cheeks stretch and burn, so he stopped and made do with a grin that involved only the left half of his face. Max was at the breathless stage of crying, which means he was kind of at the end of crying because he had cried a lot. And he clung to his sister so tightly his fingers were pressing bruises on her skin. She was leaning over to one side to hold him up, shaking with the effort. They looked, Fred thought, like a two-headed creature, arms entwined. Entwined is one of our key vocabulary words for this week. Pause the video and have a go. Do you remember what entwined means? Well done if you said wind or twisted together. It's almost like something has been interweaved. So in this instance, it shows that Max and his sister's arms were twisted together. Is your brother badly hurt? He asked. Lila patted her brother desperately on the back. He won't talk. He's just crying. Con looked back towards the fire and shivered. The flames cast a light on her face. She was no longer blonde. Her hair was grey with soot and brown with blood, and she had a scratch on her shoulder that looked deep. Are you all right? He asked, wiping rain out of his eyes. That cut looks bad. No, I'm not all right, Con's back. We are lost in the Amazon jungle, and statistically speaking, it's very likely that we are going to die. I know. Fred didn't feel he needed reminding. I meant, so no. Con's voice grew thin and high. I think it would be safe to say that none of us are all right. Not at all. Not even slightly. The bushes rustled, which means that the bushes were moving, maybe because of the wind. The rain hammered down on Fred's face, suggesting here it's pouring down with rain. We need to find shelter, he said. A big tree or a cave or something that would... No, Max gave a sudden scream, a yell that was wet with spit and fear. Fred stepped backwards, raising his hands. Don't cry, I just thought... Then his eyes followed Max's pointing finger. There, 3 inches from Fred's shoe, was a snake. It was speckled brown and black, patchwork to match the jungle floor, and its head was as big as a fist. The language here used to describe how the snake looks shows that it actually camouflages in with the jungle floor, so it probably suggesting that the floor is filled with branches and twigs that match the skin of the snake. For 1 second, nobody breathed. The jungle waited. Then Max let out a second scream that dug deep into the night, and 4 of them turned and fled, which means 4 of them turned and ran off. The ground was sodden, suggesting that it was soaked with water, and they ran pell-mell, frantically, that's another synonym for frantically, sending up mud into one another's eyes and grazing their elbows against the trees. Grazing, you could have another synonym for grazing, which is scratching. So they scratched their elbows against the trees as they were running so fast. Fred ran as if his body were not his own, faster than he'd ever run. His palms stretched ahead of him. He tripped over a root and turned a full somersault, coming up spitting earth. He ran on. The rain blinded him, and shadows flashed past him in the darkness. There was a yell behind him. Please, Max, said Lila. Fred turned back, skidding in the mud. He won't run. Lila bent over her brother. And I can't carry him. The little boy lay on his back, weeping again, crying up at the sky, his whole body shaking in the driving rain. All the language here suggests to me that Max is feeling terrified. Come on! Fred heaved Max over his shoulder, which means put Max over his shoulder. The boy was far heavier than he'd expected, and he screamed as Fred lifted him. But Fred grabbed both of Max's knees and started running, his whole body screaming with pain. He could hear Lila, her feet thumping close behind them. The stitch in Fred's side was almost unbearable, which means he couldn't tolerate the pain. When he tore out of the trees and into a sudden clearing, he halted, which means almost like a sudden stop, and Max bumped his head against Fred's spine and yelled. Angrily, he began trying to bite one of Fred's shoulder blades. "Please don't," said Fred, but he was barely paying attention to the boy on his back. He stared stunned ahead of him. This again suggesting that all the characters are feeling quite scared because Fred's not worried that actually Max is biting him. Instead, he's more concerned with the snake. They were standing at the edge of a wide circle of trees, open to the sky and lit by a fat moon. There was a carpet of green moss, and the stars above them were clustered so thickly that the silver outnumbered the night. Clustered again means gathered together. Fred lowered Max to the ground and stood bent over, his hands on his thighs, panting. "Did the snake chase us?" said Max. "No," gasped Con. "How do you know?" wailed Max. Lila dropped to her knees, clutching at her side. "Snakes don't. Maxie, we both know that. I just panicked," said Con. Her voice was bitter, suggesting she was quite angry. "That's what happened. See? Look, no snakes. We were stupid. Now we're even more lost." The ground in the clearing sloped slightly towards a large puddle of water. Fred crossed over it, his muscles aching, and sniffed. It smelt of rotting things, but he was feverishly thirsty. The language here all suggests that Fred is coming up with a fever. The word feverishly helps me to understand that because it means showing symptoms of a fever. You can have feverishly in two different contexts, but in this context, it means that Fred was coming up with a fever. And the language also suggests this because his muscles were aching, and he was so thirsty he was just drinking the water that smelled quite bad. So I'd like you now to pause the video, get hold of your activity, and we're going to do the first few questions together. I'd like you now to pause the video and have a go at the activity. Please only come back to the video once you have finished. So let's have a look at the rest of the statements. So the second statement I've ticked true, and that is because they heard a voice from the bush, and the accent actually wasn't British, it was something softer. Next, we have Fred was by himself when the kids came out from behind the bush. Well, on page 10, it states that Fred actually said to them to come out from behind the bush because he's alone. Next, Constantia likes being called Con for short, and that is true because she said that if they didn't call her Con, she'd kill them. I know she was probably joking. And then next, we had Con thought they had a good chance of survival. Well, actually, that is false because she said statistically speaking, which means according to some facts, that actually won't have a chance of survival in the Amazon rainforest. And lastly, Lila was running in front of Fred. Well, that's actually false because she was running behind Fred. We're now going to go into our find and copy section. I have actually written the first word in, but I'm going to give my explanation for that. So it's asking you to find the word, so that means a single word, to suggest that Fred was out of breath from running away from the snake. Well, I'm going to firstly turn to page 14, so you should be doing that. And I'm going to have a look where I found panting and then give my reason for that. So I looked for the evidence here, and it was here. I read the text, I looked for the evidence, and it said, Fred lowered Max on the ground and stood bent over, his hands on his thighs, panting. This suggests that Fred was out of breath from running from the snake, which is how I know that he's panting, suggesting that he was out of breath. I'd like you now to turn to page 9. I need to find the word that suggests that Fred didn't have much hair left on his arms. So you need to turn to page 9. I'd like you now to pause the video and have a go at the rest of find and copy. Come back to the video once you have finished find and copy so we can have a mark together. Well done if you spotted that the word is remaining, which means that because his hairs were singed and charred, which suggests that they were slightly burnt, he had not much hair left on his arm. So you're going to copy that word in, and it's remaining. Next, we need to turn to page 12, and you need to look for the word that tells you that the rain fell heavily. Well, I'm going to turn to page 12. So, the bushes rustled, the rain hammered down on Fred's face. Well, already from reading that sentence, the rain hammered down suggests that it was pouring down with rain, and it was falling quite heavily. So I'm actually going to copy down because it's just asking for the word hammered. And then lastly, we need to read this I think it's a snippet from a paragraph. So the ground in the clearing sloped slightly towards a large puddle of water. Fred crossed over it, his muscles aching, and sniffed. It smelt of rotting things, but he was feverishly thirsty. So we need to look for a phrase now. So that means a sentence to suggest that Fred was in pain. And it's from this section here. So the ground in the clearing sloped slightly towards a large puddle of water. Fred crossed over to it, his muscles aching, and sniffed. Well, that phrase, his muscles aching, suggests that he was in some sort of pain. So I'm going to copy that down using my speech marks by taking it out of the text. His muscles aching. Aching suggests that he was in pain. Well done if you got those correct. If you haven't, please go in with a different colour pen or a pencil and make those corrections. It's great to learn from your mistakes. Now we're going to answer the questions together. I'd like you firstly to have a go at the questions and then come back to the video once you've finished the questions so we can mark through together. So let's answer the questions now together. The first question is, how many children were in the Amazon rainforest? Well, from the text, we already know about Fred, who we were introduced at the beginning of the chapter. We now know Con, Max, and Lila. So there's 4 children in the Amazon rainforest. You should have written down 4 children. 4 children. Where did Fred suggest they could go to protect themselves from the bad weather? Oh, I remember on page 11, I believe, around page 11 to 13, Fred suggested that they go under a big tree or a cave in order to find some shelter from the bad weather. So in this sentence, it should be a big tree or a cave in order to find some shelter from the bad weather. Now, there, 3 inches from Fred's shoe was a snake. It was speckled brown and black patchwork to match the jungle floor, and its head was big as a fist. What does the description suggest about what you might find on the jungle floor? So from here, the description to me suggests that on the jungle floor, you may find some snakes, and they're usually camouflaged in with bits from the jungle. So that could be branches, twigs, and that's what you're likely to find, which is quite scary. Now you need to turn to page 12, and on page 12, you need to look for this piece of evidence that can answer this question, which is, how can you tell the snake was closer to Fred? Well, on page 12, the language suggests, it says, there, 3 inches from Fred's shoe was a snake. So here it suggests that actually the snake was quite close to Fred because it was only 3 inches away. That's what you should have written in that sentence. Next, explain why Lila thinks they should listen to her parents' advice. Well, in the text, it doesn't really speak about Lila's parents. However, taking on from the nurturing role, so this suggests that Lila almost plays on a motherly figure to Max. What does it suggest about Lila? Well, I think that reading from this question is that actually Lila thinks that they should listen to their parents' advice because they're in somewhere that they don't know where they are, so they need to listen to what their parents have said to help them keep safe. And then lastly, you need to look at page 13, and how can you tell that Max was in a distressed state? Well, it suggests that he was crying and his whole body was shaking through the rain. This suggests that he was quite distressed, which means that he was quite terrified, scared because of the situation they were in. And then for your extension, this is where you need to submit onto Seesaw your prediction with what is going to happen next. I know most classes have now read on, and that's absolutely fine. You can summarise the chapter there. So what I'd like you to do now, Year 6, is finish marking off all your sentences and then take a picture and submit it onto Seesaw. Your teachers would love to see the great reading work you are doing. So continue with that great work.